There we are. Just a quick reminder to everyone present. Please feel free to make comments in the question and answer, and I will try and get to them as quickly as I can, as there are gaps in the information I'm giving out. For our student members, just you can ask questions directly to other panelists, and that means only I and the other students would see your comment, or you may post it more generally, and that is up to you. Especially if you need to contact me for something personal, you may not want to broadcast it out to everyone. All right, give me 1 second to get rid of my gum, and then we'll get going. All right, great. So welcome to Class 2 Introduction to Sufism. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy lives to spend a little bit of time with us on this concept of what is Sufism, where does it come from, what are its origins. And for these first few classes, in the introduction class, it was just a taste, and we were sort of giving a very broad overview of Sufism and the Sufi tradition. And with this class, I notice someone's mic may be on. I'm just going to mute. There we are. Thank you. All right. As for these next couple of classes, what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about the epistemology of Sufism, and just so that we're not scared off by the 5 cent words, let's bracket epistemology and say it is the study of knowledge and study of how we acquire knowledge. Where does the knowledge come from? What is the basis of our knowledge? And that will, of course, differ depending on when in time you are as well. So, for example, in Greek medicine, the basis of knowledge may have been construed quite differently than it would in Western medicine. And these kind of sensitivities to what constitute our episteme are extremely important to understand what we're dealing with. So, in the case of what is Sufism, since we are studying this in the Western Academy, uh, in this class, we're going to be accounting for what rightly are we going to be looking at? What constitutes Sufism in the academic study of religion? And in the following class next week, we're going to begin the historical study of Sufism, where it comes from, its origins in Baghdad with the Syriac brothers and other mystic movements, which sort of combine to give essence to this sort of term Sufism, this catch-all term. All right, so let us begin. Just a heads up and a reminder to both students and members of the public who are joining us that the core text is Sufism, An Introduction to the Mystical Traditions of Islam by Carl Ernst. Carl Ernst is a professor at the University of North Carolina. His lineage of knowledge comes from a very well-regarded source, that of Anna Marie Schimmel at Harvard. And Carl Ernst is something of he's regarded with his colleague Chittick as being some of the best Western scholars on Sufism. There are other choices, of course. We could have chosen Sayyid Hussein Nasr or others, but I wanted to work with this textbook because it aligns pretty well with the academic study of religion, as opposed to pursuing Sufism as a personal intellectual pursuit. And so Ernst is talking very directly to the academic study of religion. He's been heavily involved with the American Academy of Religion, and so that's why this textbook over others. And for those that may complain that we shouldn't only hand over all the authority to some old white guy writing a book, well, you have an aging brown guy here to offer you some insights as well. So maybe that will complement it. All right. Okay, let's get into it then. So here in the slide from Punch Comics in 1858, we have here the ascension of the Queen of India. And here on the right, we've got an Indian, dark-skinned Indian woman, sort of grasping. She looks a bit disheveled, and she's grasping at Queen Victoria's skirts. This image, of course, hides the brutality that made this final shift in colonialism possible. India had become we have to remind ourselves that at this point in history, the games of empire were in full swing. And so by the 1750s, the English realized that their primary opponents in a place like India were going to be the French. And so there was an escalation by both the English and the French about exerting control over India. And we must remember that the kind of colonies that they were interested in setting up in these places were not the same as the kind of colonies that they were setting up in North America. North American colonies initially was about resource extraction. And so when you're primarily concerned with resource extraction, whether those are pelts, whether it's wood, whether it's fish, the indigenous population is going to work as an inconvenience or partners that then provide the goods which you can purchase. And there is not going to be a civilizational project here as such. But once the shift in empire comes to a settler colony, at that stage, the concern will become for what do we do with this native question? In India, there was always a consciousness that there just wouldn't be the numbers necessary to have a massive settler colony in India. So you had to work with the people who were already there. And if you have a linear conception of history in which we naturally go from living in caves to now living in condos, you would think that the civilizations that you encounter in India may be on a higher scale than the civilizations you may have encountered in a place like Halifax. Not to say that these civilizations weren't sophisticated here, but rather according to the English model, they did not have the sophistication that the English would then ascribe to a certain level of civilization. And so in India, they realized that they would have to work with local princes and local powers to assert their control. And the shift in India comes is initially what the English are interested in doing is controlling the land by administering the land. So what they offer to princes is, for example, that they will use modern techniques to give the princes information about their people. So they may have asked an Indian prince, for example, how many people live on your land? What is the acreage of your land? What is the yield of that acreage? And if the Indian prince did not have good responses to those questions, then they would say, well, why don't you let us conduct surveys? We'll go out, we'll figure out your acreage, we'll figure out your population, we'll then help you figure out what the tax burden should be. And so they inserted themselves in India as middlemen. They escalated their presence against the French, and it wasn't until the so-called Mutiny in the 1850s, or alternatively called the first the first kind of revolutionary war for in India, or the first uprising in India, the English take control. Now that's the famous story of the Enfield rifles, which were being used by the Indian sepoys, were had packages which had meat or beef or pork tallow on the outside of the package to keep the black powder dry. And it would require tearing with your teeth before you poured it into the gun. And this, plus general dissatisfaction with British rule, made a lot of the army rise up in revolt. After that, the decision was made to put the Queen in charge of India and to take it away from company rule. So that was the shift that we see in the British East India Company rule, shifting over then to the imperial rule. And this is the ascension of the Queen of India, is sort of beautifully hides all of that bloody drama in the background, right? Because the end of the Sepoy Mutiny was mass massacres of those who had participated. All right. So Europe has, for all intents and purposes, arrived in Asia, has discovered Asia, and is now spreading itself all over and asserting its control through a number of different means. You may recognize some of the names involved in this because they're the names of the streets that we have in cities like Halifax. So when you see names like Dalhousie, Dalhousie was one of the governor generals of India. In fact, one of the things that Lord Dalhousie invented was a taxation system to help get Muslim princes off their land, right? So these names are not unknown to us. Were you in Toronto, you would also be on Dundas Street, Elphinstone Road. All of these names are names of colonial, very powerful colonial administrators who got very rich in India and learned some of the techniques that they would then deploy in India and learned techniques in India that they would then deploy here. And this sort of deeply layered and complicated history is not often taught in a nuanced fashion. So that's why we don't make these connections. Um, but if you are interested, if you go and take a look at the Maritime Museum, whenever that's next possible, there is a figurehead for a masthead. Sorry, not masthead, but the figurehead that you would put on the front of a ship at in the hall across the way from Merlin, the parrot. And there, what you will see is that masthead was made in India, and it's in the design of an Indian goddess, repainted like Britannia, and mounted on a ship uh, for the kind of Sultan of Oman. And then it was donated, and it was called the HMS Imam, and it was donated to the British Navy, and then eventually scuttled in the Caribbean and brought here with a visitor to these lands. And so these imperial connections are deeply layered and deeply complicated. And that's how even a city like Halifax factors into this swirl of populations, people, and goods that's going to be taking place under colonialism, which continues to this day. Like, I don't think it's a surprise that I end up here, right? It's because I am the sort of flotsam of colonialism washed ashore in Nova Scotia. I'll be more generous to myself in the future, but let's start there. um, so what we have during the 15th, 16th, 17th century is this mass expansion of European power, mass expansion of European wealth, and concentration of wealth also amongst the small classes of people in Europe, the so-called nabobs and others. In addition to this expansion, the expansion also comes with its own conceptions of race, its own conceptions of knowledge, its own conceptions of how it is going to deal with the subject populations that it's going to be encountering. Here are some examples of the ways that this would be narrated back to local populations in terms of print advertising. These would have been 19th century examples. So here on the left, you have the birth of civilization, a message from the sea. Underneath it says the consumption of soap is a measure of the wealth of civilization, health, and purity of the people. Sigmund Freud would have a similar theory, and he would place Japan fairly high in that scaling system because he said determined civilization by the use of soap. So here, Paris soap is sort of advertising itself as civilization arriving in this certain cleanliness, or alternatively, civilization is a certain hygiene of civilization. In fact, one thing that you would encounter a lot in colonial accounts of India is the smell of Indian cities, and it seems to be that's the kind of one area in which colonials were able to assert their claim to superiority. If it was not in poetry and music and elsewhere, they could at least assert that there was some benefit to copying European cleanliness and hygiene, because cities, of course, historically have always collapsed because of pandemic, because of cholera, because of the mixing of feces and drinking water and what have you. So this was a way to narrate those truths into part of the civilizing mission. And so you will have here Parasoap using this famous phrase, the white man's burden. And again, in the imagery surrounding this white captain, on the left-hand side, you have Parasoap arriving. On the right-hand side, you have a missionary receiving a native. So this idea of civilization, Christianity, cleanliness, all of these factors are kind of mixing and blending and constituting part of the punch of colonialism. All right. What happens during this period as well? Let me go back to the previous slide and just elaborate on this a little bit. Is that when we encounter these other populations, so when the European West encounters these other populations, the first few stages are first is what resources are there to exploit? How can we make ourselves useful and in turn benefit from this relationship that we're going to cultivate with these people? And do they have resources which are not valuable to them but highly valuable to us? For example, things like spices, which have value even in India, but have much more value in a place like Europe. Okay. The other thing is you will want an intellectual field will begin to develop in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries about the study of the East. And often these will be housed in departments of Oriental studies, and the gentlemen, and often it is gentlemen, who will involve themselves in this study will refer to themselves as Orientalists. Now, initially, even though today, when we hear the word Orientalist, we tend to assume that Orientalist is a bad term, a negative term, at the time, in these departments of Oriental studies, an Orientalist, so for example, Gibb, who calls himself a chief Orientalist, it's not an insult to his mind. Or these departments of Oriental studies were often one of the first places where Eastern languages would be studied, so-called Eastern languages would be studied, like Persian, like Hindustani or Hindavi, or alternatively Arabic. And the study of languages would also constitute the study of linguistic systems. So a lot of theories were developed about Indo-Aryan languages, so when there's claims being made as to national inheritances and better and worse peoples, the Aryan peoples, for example, part of these studies are drawing upon all of this mass collection of colonial information that takes place under empire. Um, and not to say that it doesn't happen before 1978, because you see echoes of it in the writings of the anthropologist and ethnographer Bernard Cohen. You will see certain objections being raised in the work of Ambedkar and others. But Edward Said really voices the complaint in public in the West, in New York, in his book in 1978 on Orientalism. And he ends up in a very public debate and argument with Bernard Lewis at Princeton University, who's a product of the English Academy. And he and Bernard Lewis will really get into it on this question of Orientalism. Now, in general, people tend not to read the book Orientalism very closely. They get the Cliff Notes version, but what I'll, the, but what, and I'm about to give that to you too, but I do suggest you spend some time with it. Edward Said is a good writer, and as such, his arguments are extremely persuasive and thoughtful. And Orientalism may not even necessarily be his best work. It may be Culture and Imperialism or others, but it's the first shot across the bow and is significant as such. Now, the image of him that I have here in our slides, just a quick check. Everyone is seeing the slides. Am I right? I did not do that quick check-in at the very start. Okay, I think we are seeing the slides. Great. Also, a quick question has come up here in the chat, and I see here, would the white man's burden be defined as the colonizers believing their cultures or customs needed to be forced upon other populations to civilize them? Okay, so the interesting word that has been added to that question is needed. And to my understanding, the sense was that because history is the history of progress. Now, this was important, especially after Darwin. Darwin had a really major impact. Now, before Darwin, these thoughts were already out there, but Darwin kind of helped add the allure of science to the study. So for after Darwin, there was this sense that civilization is a stages process, that we are advancing and improving, and that liberalism, and this would be what Francis Fukuyama would argue in the 80s and 90s, is he would say we have reached the end of history. Liberalism is the obvious end of history. This is how all of our relationships in the future are going to be negotiated. It is on these Western conception of liberalism. Now, how do we get there? How are we convinced that our stage is the most developed? The English conceptualized their imperial expansion and civilizational project on one level on liberty. They argued that English liberty spreading out to the colonies was ultimately a good for the colonies. And if they stamped out ignorance, if they stamped out, the problems with how women and children were treated in foreign countries according to their standards. So if they stamped out those things, that they would bring civility. So it's not that those people needed to be civilized. It's just that the great project of liberty is to bring all humanity into this stage of liberalism. The problem, of course, was that even though the goal on a meta level may be very noble, is it worth all of the people that will have to die for it? Is it worth all of the angst that will be caused amongst these populations in their loss of language? Or in the case of Canada, where the civilizational project is hand in hand with the genocidal project. So is civilization uh, uh, we'll only save the ones that can be civilized, and we'll just allow the rest to die or murder them. So, this need to spread our civilization is at question, but the English wanted very much the resources that were available there, the wealth of India, and they needed to justify how they were going to do it. And so they had this great narrative of, once we have made you liberal and modern, we'll leave. And that's exactly what Gandhi and Jinnah and others were saying to the British Parliament, was that we are here, we've reached that level, it's time for you all to get gone. Okay, so a little bit of a play with that question, but I hope I answered it adequately. Now let's get to the figure of Edward Said again. So just to bring us back to the story, 1978, Edward Said is having this argument with Bernard Lewis, and what Edward Said essentially argues in his book Orientalism is he's going to say that Orientalism is not just construction of knowledge, is not just the collection of knowledge, but it is the collection of knowledge with a purpose. And the purpose may not necessarily be the best hopes and dreams of the people who you are dominating. Rather, when Orientalists are collecting knowledge, they're collecting it for the benefit of people that are not the primary people that they're taking that information from. So when you go and when you survey, here's how it would work. So when I go and survey the villages initially, the villagers may not oppose the coming of a survey. This weirdo wants to come in and count heads. Let it happen. The next year, however, when he comes and he gives you your new tax statement based on this new assessment, and it's much, much higher than what it used to be, you might say, let's not allow another survey taker in here. So the collection of that knowledge is not neutral. The collection of that knowledge is for a purpose and deployed for a purpose. Edward Said will point the finger at most of these Orientalists and say they're kind of doing the same thing. They're making it possible for empire to exist. They're making it possible because the arguments, the things that they choose to study, the way that they choose choose to study things makes it seem almost that the East is suffering under great despotism, which it will only be saved by the arrival of European liberalism. And so when we make that argument, and that argument is asserted consistently in all of the literature that's being generated about the East, it seems to a common person that you're doing them a favor by saving them. And that is the narrative of colonialism, is it is that we that you cannot save yourselves and we're here to do it for you, and it'll just happen to be on the model which we ourselves have, although you won't get the full packet of rights as those in the center. You are this is the you are at the periphery, and the people in the metropole will enjoy the full goodies of colonialism, and the people at the periphery are the ones who are going to get screwed a bit. Those are that a little bit of a summary of some of the ideas of Sheldon Pollock, who I would strongly advise you read if you're interested in that relationship between center and the metropole and the periphery. So Edward Said raises this concern. He says the collection of knowledge is not dispassionate. And even if the collection of knowledge seems innocent on some level, it can have extremely negative consequences on the people who are impacted by how that knowledge gets used. And because this knowledge was being produced in places like Oxford and Cambridge and then being given to British politicians, many people also assumed that all the India that was worth knowing was contained in British books. And this can create a really important dissonance as well, because the thing which you have in the textbooks written by Orientalists is entirely distinct from the thing that you will encounter on the ground. You have to add in all of the necessary biases. This is someone who has never been exposed to India, may not speak the language, is traveling around there as a tourist, and is writing a book that then is designed to be sold. So there's going to be a certain fanciful material is going to be thrown into these books. There's going to be a fetishization of difference, a fetishization of the other. And you're going to see that especially in artwork, which is something that Edward Said draws our attention to as well. So take, for example, the following painting. This is Jean-Joseph Constant, and this is called Le Favori d'Emir. And this is from 1879, The Favorite of the Emir, from 1879. Any initial thoughts from the students or members of the public about this painting, and sort of what you are seeing in this painting? Right, it is beautiful. That was the first comment there, but it is lush. The colors are so rich and so vibrant. It feels like your senses are being overwhelmed. And you're absolutely right. Another student has pointed out that the women are portrayed extremely sensually or sexually in this case. The colors even of their clothing is erotic. The setup is again part of this idea of the harem. And this yes, that's exactly it, is what we would see is in a lot of British literature, in French literature, there was this obsession with the harem. Because since the Crusades, up until the 19th and 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was conceived by many to be the great other. It was the other of Europe. It existed right on the periphery of Europe. And after the kind of ascension of Tamerlane, there was this fear that this other could overwhelm us. And there was a fetishization of this other. And so, especially the spaces that were hidden from European eyes. So, it is very unlikely that Jean Joseph Constant ever entered the private women's quarters of any Ottoman noble. Yet, there are hundreds of paintings like this, all fetishizing the space hidden from the view of the public. And these kind of images are exactly like this. They're lush, they're rich, they're beautiful. And there's also this racial play here because at the top left and behind the pillar on the far right, you have dark skinned, what we would assume to be slaves, who are sort of servicing these women. And also another kind of indicator of the maybe the sexual depravity of the Ottomans is the thing that's partly at criticism here, is that European women would be taken and put into their harems, right? This was also this we need to defend our race and our women, and that was always a very easy way to get kind of energies riled up. Even though you have to keep in mind that from the Balkans to Bengal, you have all a very wide variety of shades of humanity, right? So, all right, let us continue. So at this time, the Orientalist study was expanding into India. You were going to see universities rising up in cities like Calcutta, where British presence was established early. In particular, this one figure here, Sir William Jones or William Jones, also known as Orientalist Jones sometimes, he was one of the most important figures of this period. He was trained in Persian and learned other languages locally and was translating a lot of documents. So a prime example of how this would work is, for example, the William Jones wanted to translate Arabic or Persian books of law so that the British could administer Muslim law for Muslims. There was this sense that when the British initially established contact, that there was a desire not to disrupt the judicial systems of the established place. But as the empire grew in strength, increasingly the British started setting up courts in India. So, for example, the Chancellery of Bombay would have a court, and there would be a court in Calcutta, and these courts ultimately would have their appeal to the Star Chamber back in England. So debates about who gets how you pray in a Muslim mosque that is debated, and then there's a lawsuit that takes place over that, were ultimately resolved in the Star Chamber in England. So if that when we talk about in Ontario and elsewhere about the creeping of Sharia into Canada, it does sound a bit weird to the ears of a historian because a lot of that so-called Sharia law was made by British administrators in India, and often Indians are trying to import the stuff that they had from that context back here, and so people like Jones were very important in translating texts to help the British rule over India. And this is one of the Orientalist tropes that's really important for us to have a sensitivity to and a consciousness of, is the trope about what is better and what is good knowledge, right? So for British Europeans, they wanted texts. Text was key for them. Text was more important than even living interlocutors. A text they felt was somehow more valuable, and so the mass translation of texts was something that took place at this time, including by William Jones himself. And often the text was used against the everyday interpretations of people, even in things like lawsuits. So at this time, one of the tropes about Sufism was Sufism and Islam are distinct, and that Sufism can be abstracted from Islam. The idea that Sufism isn't really part of Islam, in fact, the Sufis may work closer with the colonial administrations, is what they believed. They thought that Sufis were naturally rule breakers and nonconformists, which would make them easier to deal with than real Muslims who may even have an allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, right? So the fear was the caliphate of the Ottomans, which exerted at least emotional control over the Muslims of India, that they would oppose colonialism until sort of colonialism had established new kinds of authority locally. And so projects in India were about unsettling the kind of Ottoman control, but also establishing the British as authentic and real and good administrators of even Muslim affairs. In fact, that was a marker of their rationality, was the fact that they could administer Muslim lawsuits and Hindu lawsuits and Parsi lawsuits and do it successfully, um, uh, to their mind. um, the other thing that they did was they invented a certain narrative of Islam's presence in India, which continues to have really important impacts to this day. One of the things that they argued was this myth of Oriental despotism, was the idea that Muslims came into India as conquerors, brought everyone under their heel by the sword, and that's how they came to dominate India under the Mughal Empire. That history is not really factual. They're primarily because India is massive, and there was no sort of Muslim rule that pierced all the levels of society the way that the modern state would, and. Also, in these studies, the British developed theories about Islam's rise and fall. And one of the ideas which has been latched onto, in particular by conservative Muslims as well, is that Islam has gone through various golden ages. And when Islam goes through a golden age, that's the perfection of its society. That's when it's the sort of shining beacon. That's when it presents itself as a world system worthy of other world systems such as Christianity. But that because Islam has fallen into a dark age, and part of that dark age can be blamed on these Sufis, is the reason why the Islamic world is weak. Now, conservative Muslims have mapped onto that too, and that is one of the reasons why they're extremely critical of Sufis, is because their argument is that these Sufis have made Islam weak, have made Islam internally fractious, and that is again one of the myths that you hear a lot. So when you hear someone talking about golden ages in Islam, that person is spinning fantasy. All right, that there is no such thing as a golden age. In video games, you can have a golden age. In Sid Meier's Civilization, you get a banner that'll say we have entered a golden age. That's not how reality works. That's not how history works. And also, one must always remember that every age of mass progress is often going to be because we have ground up the people at the bottom to make that sort of progress possible. So, golden age to whom would also be an important question when we're using a mischaracterizing phrase like that. But these are typical Orientalist tropes as well. These early scholarly encounters would include books that are available now as part of the public domain, as such as 1868's The Dervishes or Oriental Spiritualism by John P. Brown. And if you want to find these older texts, I would really advise you look them up on archive.org. A lot of them are available as PDFs, but please, I caution you that when you read the texts from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries about Islam written by Orientalist scholars, that you have to read it with eyes open. And you have to read it with the sort of sensitivity, because these documents were created to continue the functioning of an empire. So we have to have that caveat in place when we read them. So the kinds of knowledge contained in them exists to make these people dominable. Okay, that's important, and we must not forget that. So read them, but read them with caution. Uh, Very popular in European publishing at the time was these wonders of the Orient kind of texts and books, and often they would figure mystical figures from India, fakirs and dervishes. There was an obsession also with the Thuggee cults, which you see brought to light in a kind of racist but over the top and fun fashion in the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The Thuggees, the group which is kind of implicated in that, were an invention of the British colonizer. There may have been groups in the area who were committing looting and robbery, but the Thuggee cult, the idea that there were cults of muggers and people who would hang people, choke people to death, was a bit of a fantasy. But those fantasies sold really well in Europe, and so they were extremely successful. And so any texts in this sort of Wonders of the Orient class did extremely well, and that was Europe's introduction to the Sufis, was through these Wonders series. Often they were based on inaccuracies or inaccurate translations or documents that just were flat out wrong. So, in the case of Dabistan, a 17th century Persian text, it was actually a polemical text written against Sufis. So, if you are translating it and saying this is the authentic word on Sufis, but it's an anti Sufi text, even though it's in Persian, doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to take the side of the people sort of being challenged by the text. And so translations of texts like Dabistan or Dabistan, which was used as a reference when writing books like John Brown's here, would result in a lot of misinformation about the Sufis. A lot of that misinformation persists to this day. And often the extremes were the characters of the fakir and the dervish. These characters would start showing up in European plays and stories as well. In fact, that was the term that Winston Churchill used for Gandhi when Gandhi came to Parliament. He said, we're going to let this fakir arrive. Fakir and dervish, also fakir in a punny way, in English can be translated as faker, right? So fakir, faker, it's almost like a fake holy man, a charlatan, a huckster. And that's often what the English thought about the Sufis that they would encounter in places like India. They thought that the average Sufi, the kind of guy you would encounter on the street, was fairly unsophisticated and was just begging with a gimmick. Right, so their gimmick was that they were a holy man, and you had seen things like that in Europe. You would see things like that if you went on pilgrims walks through Spain. Those were the kind of characters that they thought that they were encountering. But there was not a whole lot of careful analysis done into the more sophisticated existence of Sufism, especially in the work of the ulama and scholars, in the groups of ulamas and scholars who would themselves have been Sufis, although they may not self designate as such, that they participated in Sufism, mystical thought, and in the mystical traditions, and in the writing about the mystical traditions, but may not have self referred as Sufis or may not be easily identifiable as Sufis, because we have to keep in mind the kind of Sufi mendicant who takes a vow of poverty, walks around in a state of undress, begs for food, sings for their supper, is very different from the head of a school like the Farangi Mahal, the head of a school of ulama who would be well established, who would have homes in their main cities, who would have homes in even in a place like Mecca where they would go to learn. So that kind of Sufi is very different from the kind of Sufi that most Europeans would have encountered in these kind of port towns. In addition, something that started showing up in European writing about Sufism was this question of transhuman spiritualism. There was this idea that all spirituality comes from India. This was the kind of ideas it started showing up in Max Muller's work in Germany and in England. In his writing, his belief is that the spiritual core of the whole world, or where the kind of mystical spiritualism begins, is in India, and then it expands outwards. And that's the kind of thing that the theosophical societies and others are interested in when they're present there. Is that there's universalizing tendency of humanity, that all humans share this common heritage, and it may come from this place. Now, one of the problems with painting with that broad a brush is that you have to ignore or just push to the side a whole lot of indigenous negotiations which would have organically grown up around Sufism. And that was one of the main consequences, is Sufism started to develop into an academic idea. So by the 1950s, for example, Sufism was a thing in the Western Academy, but a very different thing on the ground in a place like India, on the ground in a place like Senegal, or in a place like Tajikistan. So we have to keep in mind that the knowledge or the epistemological basis of our understanding of Sufism is based on scholarly work, which is often divorced entirely from the practice on the ground. And that's a tension we're going to be negotiating with all throughout the semester. Okay. Um, here's a question that comes up a little bit, and this was actually raised by Rosina Ali in 2000 in 2017. She wrote an article in the New Yorker called "The Erasure of Islam from the Poetry of Rumi," and what you're going to see is a lot of the translations of Rumi. In So Rumi, for those of you who may not know, is was a Muslim, as indicated in the graphic, and he draws very deeply on Islam and the traditions of Islam and the Quran in his poetry. However, Rumi is also the most popular poet in English in the United States, Canada, and much of Europe as well. And that's because a majority of the translations of Rumi remove the Islamic stuff and translate it just as transhuman, universalizable mysticism. And the problem is when you do that, is that when you decontextualize Rumi in that way, you lose a lot of the power of his verse. And not only that, but you lose a lot of the subversion and the sneaky kinds of things that Rumi is trying to do, especially to laugh at men of knowledge, such as myself, scholars such as myself. The play that he is engaging with is extremely beautiful in when it's given its Islamic context. And as long as we're insistent on making Rumi a secular mystic or a mystic separate from any particular tradition, the consequence is that not only do we misunderstand Rumi, but we may misapply the kinds of stories and lessons and play that he's encouraging us to do. So there's desire for a commonality of humanity against difference, but this decontextualization really does hurt the thing itself. And this is in Konya, sorry, in Izmir, Turkey. This is a photograph of his shrine in Turkey, and again, the his hands. Just as a heads up for what we're looking at there, the first hand receives the baraka, receives the blessing. That's where Barack Obama's name comes from, baraka. It receives the blessing, and the other hand facing downwards distributes the blessing. Imagine him as a spiritual sprinkler, right? Like receive the goodies and sprinkle them out on the earth below. So that's what Rumi is doing in his spinning in that picture, because the Mevlevi order, which is based on Rumi's teachings, they are the whirling dervishes and the spinning orders. And their argument is that spinning is the natural order of the universe, and in that spinning you are imitating the atom, and that is they and often from people who spin. They say that after you get over the dizziness, which takes a lot to do, you will achieve spiritual ecstatic states through the spinning. A trick that I have heard helps if you ever want to try spinning yourself. Focus on an object in the far distance. It helps you not fall over dizzy. Um, just a heads up. All right. Let's get to a couple more. The next section here, so this initial part of today's lecture was about epistemological issues. The how do we know what we know about Sufism? Where does it come from? So today, in the modern world, our knowledge about Sufism comes primarily from scholarship, which is generated in the academy, lay practitioners who kind of are moved by mysticism and then translate works and post essays and things online. In addition to Sufis themselves, who may belong to Sufi orders such as the Naqshbandi or the Mevlevi or others, and then also everyday people on the ground that may have a more of a utilitarian use engagement with Sufism, which it may be the local place available, the local shrine available, the local place where you go to do your festival. So on each of those levels, Sufism is going to be a slightly different thing. keeping in mind that what we're doing this semester is we're dealing with the scholarly, but also a little bit of the lived reality of Sufis as well. Okay, so before I switch over to the vocabulary section, I would like us to take our 10-minute break here. This is sort of a natural pause. So let's stop here. We're going to stop for 10 minutes. I'll put a timer up on the screen. We'll take a quick break, refresh our tea, do our bio breaks, and we'll be back. So I'm going to put a timer up. Members of the public, you are welcome to stay for the next section as well. However, nearing the end, I will let you know when I'm going to switch over to student-only content. But the next chunk of today's class in particular is going to deal with the vocabulary of Sufism. What are the terms that Sufis themselves use in different contexts to refer to their own tradition? What are the primary components of it? And then, of course, we're going to play around with a couple of poems and a couple of anecdotes, and I will be happy to share those with you in 10 minutes. I will pause the recording here and then resume after 10. Thank you very much. We are back, and now I am unmuted. um, by the way, there was a question raised last class about the prophetic flame. So one of the images I had shown was the image purportedly to be of Prophet Muhammad with his head encased in a halo of flame. That's often the kind of image that you would see of prophets and in Islamic sort of miniature iconography. Um, and a question was asked last week if it may tie in to Moses' story of the burning bush. So, although there is a burning bush-like account in the Quran, there is a question about where the voice comes from, whether it comes from the fire, the bush, or a tree. But in general, when I did a bit of a look into that question, I found that flames are depicted in two sorts of ways in early iconography. There's going to be the flame of hellfire, which is depicted as sort of chaotic, erratic, and dangerous, and the flame of prophecy, which is often going to be symmetrical and centered on a figure and used primarily to obscure their features. And that inheritance is in fact from the Zoroastrian inheritance in Zoroastrian icons. That's where we see that sort of image. So as to whether or not it came from Christian iconography, it may have, but even that would have come by way of Zoroastrian iconography. So that would be where we suspect that practice of putting the flame around the prophetic halo of flame. All right. Uh, Shifting gears back into our lecture proper. Um, so there is this question of definitions that comes up a lot in Sufism, and often you're going to find Sufi manuals from all over the world, whether it be Africa, Asia, Central Asia, China, etc., that spend a lot of time on what Sufism is or what the practices of Sufism are. Now, the importance of these definitional manuals was not just that they were giving us definitions, but also the definitions themselves were being asserted as something you could meditate on. Think of it as a Zen koan or a puzzle that is meant to be considered. So take, for example, one of the stories of the Buddha. So the Buddha raises up a flower and Ananda smiles. Now, I don't know what you're meant to do with that story, but it could be used as something of deep contemplation that you would relate to it. And in the same way, a lot of these definitional texts aren't trying to assert a definition to trump all other definitions, a definition that is the correct and only definition, but often these definitions existed as to part of this literature of definitions. And that's the mistake that sometimes scholars have made historically, is to cling to one person like Shawardi or Kashariya and just say that person is all of the Sufism worth knowing. So Sufism, again, which is something important for us to understand at this stage, is going to look different depending where you are in the so-called Islamicate world, right? So if you are in Sudan, it is going to look different than if you're in Konya. It's going to look different than if you're in Isfahan or in Guangdong or what have you, right? So let's look over some of the definitions that are offered here. So, for example, we have here Sufism is an entry into exemplary behavior and a departure from unworthy behavior. All right. Sufism means that God makes you die to yourself and makes you live in Him. This is a theme that you're going to see in a lot of Sufi writings: the death to the life of the world and the awakening to the life beyond, or being able to see through the veil of unreality is something that will factor in quite importantly. And this is often depicted as dying and coming alive. And sometimes in stories like Leila and Majnun and other love stories, you'll have this sort of interaction of death and coming back to life in the beloved. Sufi is single in essence, nothing changes him, nor does he change anything. All right. A sign of sincere Sufi is that he feels poor when he has wealth, he is humble when he has power, he is hidden when he has fame. This is something that shows up a lot in the sense that the Sufi is often depicted almost a bit of a trickster that is imagine the philosopher in Plato's Perfect Society, right? So the philosopher is the one that should be the king, or should be the navigator of the ship of state, but the philosopher often will not volunteer to do its job, and will often sit off on the railings on the side, and you have to grab them as you have to pull them in and make them your solon, and they'll be involved for a couple of years, and then hopefully you can get rid of them. Sufism means that you own nothing and are owned by nothing. This is also something that we have seen ascribed to the Bhagavad Gita, to the Ali, the Prophet's cousin. Yes, Prophet's cousin. Alternatively, you're going to see Sufism means seizing spiritual realities and giving up on what a creature possesses. This is awakening to the really real behind the reality that's in front of us. Sufism means kneeling at the door of the beloved, even if he turns you away. That's sort of the relationship to God being described here. Sufism is a state when the conditions of all humanity disappear. Sufism is a blazing lightning bolt. So Karl Ernst quotes this in between pages 43 to 44. And this in this discussion, he's giving you an example of how these manuals would argue what Sufism is. So even in a manual on Sufism written by a Sufi scholar, this sort of activity is very important about correctly delineating what is the scope of this thing that we refer to as Sufism. Um, is another. So these are the terms that Ernst breaks down in his book, and he breaks it into terms such as zuhud, love, ishq, and others. So here, in the case of zuhud or zuhud, he translates it as ethics. He says here the most ancient of terms for ethical practice is zuhud, meaning asceticism or detachment and avoidance of the pleasures of the world. The ascetic or abstemious person is called a zahid. These ascetics were noted not only for their aversion to their world, to the world in general, but for fear of the hellfire. This is from page 46 of Ernst. And if you look in the Quranic text itself, there does seem to be this sort of endorsement about living humbly, living with humility in the world. You'll find phrases like that in Quran 25:63 to 65. Um, but what would this mean on a practical level? What would this Sufi ethical concept mean to the average Muslim? So for an average person, it would be that you own nothing and that nothing owns you. The idea that you could be participating in the system of capitalism, you could be buying stuff like a scarf or a tie or what have you, but yourself doesn't become tied up in the thing that you have purchased. And that seems to be one of the Sufi criticisms that's very readily available of the present, is in late stage capital, in late stage neoliberalism, you are what you buy, right? So even if you look subtly at the language of how things have shifted with airlines, in the year 2000, you were a passenger or a traveler. In the year 2020, you are a customer. You are referred to as such. In fact, even the government has taken upon themselves to start talking about us as if we are customers, as opposed to citizens. And that's because there's this sense that you are your purchases. And therefore, if you don't have anything, and if you don't have money, your value as a person with full dignity, is reduced. And that's one of the ongoing crises of the present, actually. And so perhaps this kind of wisdom speaks to us in a particular way now that it may have been quite different. Like, it just simply would not have been possible for a villager to go into debt for an iPod in ninth century Iran, or anything worth close to an iPod in ninth century Iran, right? And yet we allow people to go into debt. Well, I mean, iPod. How about the newest Apple phone, or Mac Pro? iPod. I realize I'm already dating myself 20 years, but at any rate, the illustration, I hope, is clear, that it's not that this the way that we have structured the world today is that what matters more is what you buy and how you spend your money, rather than the quality or the content of your character. For early Sufis, Zuhud al-Talata, Talata is three in Arabic, three stages of detachment. The first is to renounce the world for the sake of reward, i.e., so I would say, to follow the path of God, I want to give up my worldly goods. I want to give up my watch. I'm wearing a $15 watch. I don't know if anyone wants that, but if you give up the world, renounce your material goods to live a life of a sinlessness and commitment to God, that's the first stage, the first kind of renunciation. The second stage of renunciation is the renunciation of renunciation. This is to renounce the desire to renounce. And so you're not no longer conscious of the merit accrued by living a frugal life, so you don't care that you're living frugally. This is to renounce the ego of renunciation. So, for example, this would be, well, I have a lot of vegans that I love in my life, so maybe I'll take the risk and say this, which if I myself flirt with veganism, except for a drop of milk in my tea, I can't give that one up just yet. But with veganism, you'll find that people may often identify themselves as vegans to say that they're accruing the merit of being vegan, and they enjoy the fact that they remind you that they're vegan, or that maybe you should become vegan too, right? So that is renouncing for the sake of making you look better. And then eventually, maybe if you go long enough in veganism, you no longer feel obliged to explain or identify yourself as such. And so this is the second stage, the renouncing of the desire to renounce. And the third and final stage, this is introduced by Shiwardi in 1145 to 1234, and he adds that the Sufi recovers their free will after having lost it entirely at the second level. However, their will is no longer controlled by human desire, so they can act in a perfectly pure way. And this, of course, is the source of some considerable abuse, right? Because if someone has claimed to have ascended to this third level, and they're collecting monies for their shrine, and they're misspending those funds, they would say, I'm not attached to those actions. Those actions are like Zen actions, and so maybe they should be permissible. And what you're seeing here is something that's mirrored a bit in, for those that of you that might be familiar with Buddhism, about the way that renunciation works in Buddhism as well. So if you're reading Zen Buddhism, or if you're reading Chan Buddhism, you're going to see things like renounce the world, renounce the desire to renounce the world, so that you live in perfect state of renunciation. And that's kind of like the Buddha's state, where he becomes the Buddha, literally the enlightened one. And then at the final stage, this is what the Lotus Sutra introduces, is the idea of the Bodhisattva, that once you have rejected the world, once you have achieved the enlightenment, you come back to bring the rest of us over. So the Bodhisattva is sometimes described as a figure who returns to the world mercifully, to until every last being, until the last blade of grass is enlightened, that they have come to take you perhaps to the pure land, or what have you. This kind of conception in Sufism is captured really beautifully in the poetry of Rabi al-Basri, and this is a clip from Yasin Education on Tumblr. This says, "O God, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you for hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, begrudge me not your everlasting beauty. And that's the idea that the Rabia would sometimes, in stories, is depicted going through the city with a boiling pot of water in one hand and a burning torch in the other hand to illustrate both her points, saying, with this water, douse out the fires of hell, and with this flame, burn down the heavens. Um, but do not destroy the beloved, because the beloved's face is what you're seeking. That's the sort of style in of poetry that Rabia is capturing here, and she's a favorite figure. If you are interested in her, Rabia al-Basri, there's a lot of beautiful poetry attributed to her, and she's one of these early Muslim mystics that is really important in terms of mystic lives. Um, Moving on, the next kind of word, a loaded term that's going to show up in Sufism is the word knowledge, or in Arabic and in Farsi and in Urdu, sometimes you're going to see it as ilm. Ilm is also where we get the word alim or ulama, which is the word alim is a scholar, ulama is the plural of scholars. So these terms are kind of connected to the Sufi deployment of these terms, but those kind of knowledges are of jurisprudential knowledge, ethics, and then from that first stage, we'll go on into terms like Maulana, like you're going to see Maulana Rumi, for example, is a term that's used our master, but that could also conceivably be used for a jurisprudential scholar as well. In addition, we have this term for mystical knowledge, or a marifa, or irfan, mystical knowledge or gnosis that transcends ordinary rationality. Names such as arif, the Gnostic name, which are often tied to translations of Aristotle and Plato as well. So just as a heads up, in case you didn't know, Aristotle and Plato are reintroduced into the Western tradition, not through Europe. It is reintroduced into the Western tradition through the Islamic tradition, and the translations were made available to the papacy in Rome, and they then made those translations available to kind of wider readers and philosophers after translating them into Latin. So they go the provenance is Greek into Arabic, Arabic into Latin, Latin into European languages, is how we receive Plato and Aristotle. And often that's described as a process that would have no markers of all of those various translations. But you have to keep in mind, right, that each stage that it stops, it's going to be shaped by the ideas of the culture around it. So when we're saying that the symposia, or the kind of gymnasia from places like Greece, then move to Baghdad. So the Neoplatonists, if you're looking for them in the world at the 10th century, you will find them in Basra. You will not find them in Athens. So that's a little bit of kind of an important historical thing for us to think about. Here on the right, I have a miniature of Mullah Nasiruddin. He's a very popular figure. There is some linkage to a historical Ottoman figure as well, but he is also featured sort of as a pan-Islamic character. So stories about him show up throughout the Muslim world, and often he's doing foolish things or things which challenge conventional wisdom. So let me give you an example. A man comes to Mullah Nasiruddin's house, and he knocks on his gate. He's a washerman, and he knocks on Mullah Nasiruddin's gate, and the mullah cracks the gate open, and the man says, "Mullah, can I borrow your mule? I need it to do my labor for the day." And the mullah really doesn't want to lend this guy the mule for whatever reason. He doesn't like the guy, so he says to him, "No, no, no. Someone has already borrowed it. I'm afraid I can't lend the mule or my donkey to you." And as the mullah is about to close the gate, you hear the donkey begin to bray in the background. And the washerman puts his hand on the gate and says, "Mullah, I just heard your donkey in the back, so surely it must have been returned. Can I now borrow it?" And Mullah Nasiruddin's response is, "Are you going to believe me or some donkey?" And shuts the gate in his face. So that's the kind of story you'll see about Mullah Nasiruddin. Let me give you one more. Mullah Nasiruddin is called to a very famous mosque to teach some lessons to students. He arrives, and on the first day, he says, anyone who knows the wisdom I'm about to give you, please raise your hand. And of course, no one raises their hand. And so Mullah Nasiruddin says, I'm not going to teach this bunch of ignoramuses, and he walks out of the mosque. The next day he comes to give a lecture and he says, who knows what I'm going to say? And everyone this time raises their hands. And so Mullah Nasiruddin says, then I don't have to teach you because you all already know the lesson. And he walks out. And on the third day he arrives and he says, who knows the lesson that I'm going to teach today? Half the people raise their hands, half don't. And he says, why don't the half that do teach the half that don't? And they canceled his contract as a result. So those are often the stories of Mullah Nasiruddin. He's a trickster. He's a bit of a, he plays with wisdom traditions, with knowledge traditions. He mucks with our understanding. And that is part of the role of the Sufi in our stories from that part of the world, is the Sufi is the one who often upends the world. So think a little bit of Vasily, Saint Basil from Russia as well. He's a Yorodve, a holy fool, a fool for the sake of Christ, and he is allowed to speak back to authority. He's allowed to mock the king, mock the emperor, mock the mayor and the police chief, because he is a holy man that allows his declarations to be forgiven. And that so he operates as almost like a pressure release for the society, because you know that the people get one back by the holy man mocking those in power. All right. Let's keep going. Often you're going to see in Sufism this language of traveling showing up, and that's where even the Sufi orders themselves will be called tariqas, and they believe that the path or that Sufism is a journey. That so often in Sufi stories or in anecdotes about Sufism, it'll be the beginning of a journey or the start of a journey or the arrival after a journey. And also, suluk is a traveler, so a person who is going on a journey. And here on the right, we have a photo from the Library of Congress of a Sudanese dervish from the 1920s. And as you can see, there's a certain kind of majesty to him. Not only that incredible hair, but he's got these sort of accoutrements. He's got all sorts of medallions from the places he's traveled. He's got a staff with all sorts of trinkets and things on it. So he looks like a curio, right? And that's part of the appeal of these characters, is that they are people who move between places. And so there's a sense that they would know or learn or have a certain wisdom that may not be accessible to the settled. Another term that shows up a lot, and this is discussed in Carl Ernst on page 47, is this question of intoxication. And here I have an image on the right of the Shrained Hazrat Ali bin Osman al-Hayvari Hajveri in Lahore, a very popular site for also smoking chilam or hashish. Um, and in sometimes in the Islamic poetry and in the kind of practice of these Sufis, ecstatic states themselves are to be sought. That one wants to be in a state of ecstasy, because in a state of ecstasy is where you are closest to the divine. Now that often flies in the face of Islam's self-professed image as a middle way, or a way of non-extremes, not going to the extreme of fasting and starving yourself like the Syriac church fathers, nor kind of living in the world like the kind of Epicurean sort of philosophy. Instead, here we've got, but the Sufis will play with those ideas. And so they will say intoxication, for example, is in contrast to the sober and self-possessed traveler. Some souls were overpowered by the attraction of divine energies. These fools for God, or fools of God, lose normal rationality and could appear to be mad. Whether their condition was temporary or permanent, those who were ecstatically absorbed were often regarded as holy and were cared for and respected by ordinary people. So this is in shrine towns or in small villages, you may have the local saint who may also be defined by Western medicine as a madman. But for them, because he functions in a way outside of the normal order of things, he may be revered as a figure in that sense. And so this is often a problem also that you'll find that conservative Muslims will have with Sufis, is that, is he a Sufi, or have you just found your local madman and given him this title and then hung on his every word as if it were wisdom? And that is always the risk, and this is the thing that often comes up with kind of these non-sober Sufi orders, is that there's always the risk that, are you smoking hash to be closer to God, or are you just stoned? Are you drinking to achieve the presence of the divine, or are you just drunk? Are you dancing in a frenzy because you have found God in the heart of the frenzy, or are you dancing in a frenzy because you have lost your sanity, right? So these are often challenges and problems that Sufis will face historically, and these sort of complaints and concerns have always come up. And so this is something to be sensitive about, especially when you're reading about intoxication and things like Rumi, or in other poets as well. Love is, of course, another very important theme that'll show up, and it's often going to show up in the form of ishq. And ishq, as opposed to muhabbat or muhib, is going to be, ishq is the consuming love, is love that devours you. So, for example, an illustration of this would be in the lines, "The dream of the drop is to become fana, is to become annihilated in the stream." And so that illustrates the what this kind of love is. It's not merely carnal love, it's a transcendent love. This may be familiar to those that read Christian mysticism, such as the work of Hildegard of Bingen and others, is that the love and the mysticism in it is often sometimes couched in erotic language. So Hildegard will describe suckling on Jesus's breast, and that is an image that's quite popular in this style of mysticism and Sufism too. Uh, so love, Ernst says here on page 47, perhaps the most common epithets for mystics were drawn from the vocabulary of love and intimate affection. It was a badge of honor for these Sufis to be known as lovers of God or lovers of the Prophet Muhammad and of their Sufi master. One frequently finds people who are called simply lover or ashik, muhib, or one of the common terms for friend, such as dost, dust, or yar. The powers of affection were so central to the mystic experience that Sufi masters were often known as masters of the heart. Ahl al Dil. Ahl is the people of, and Ahli Dil is the people of the heart. Uh, all right. And here on the right, we have another miniature from the 16th century. From a man clutching the hem of his beloved. And this kind of exchange is extremely important too. And he's offering her also a wine cup, is what you can see in his hand there. Okay. Another concept that's important for us in Sufism is the relationship between the master and the disciple. Sometimes the saying that a man who does not have a master has Satan as his master is asserted. But what you see in the relationship between the Sufi and their master is that the master doesn't necessarily mean that the master is someone of high regard. So, for example, even for Rumi, his master Shams of Tabriz is a wandering mendicant. He shows up, he spends time with Rumi, he disappears. Rumi hunts him down, and then he disappears again. And so he's a character who won't be tied down, despite the fact that Rumi channels him through his heart. So here Ernst will say, master and discipleship amongst the most important designations for Sufis were those to describe the role of the spiritual master. The most common term in Arabic for old man, such as sheikh, or in Persia, and in the Persianate tradition, such as in India as well, you will use the word pir, used as a title of respect. Similar titles include ustad or guide, such as murshid. The master or teacher has in some ways functioned along the same lines as teachers of standard Islamic religious sciences, such as a madrasa or a traditional religious school, with similar reliance on transmissions going back to the time of the Prophet. This is something that we discussed in the last class, the idea of a Sufi silsila, the chain, which is to say that your claim for a Sufi order, let's say if you're a Naqshbandi of that Sufi order, you would have a scroll in your possession that would identify all of the people that you have inherited the tradition from, going back all the way to Muhammad. So you would argue that the traditions and secret teachings that Muhammad may have given his closest intimates have been channeled along this line of progenitors leading to you. And that claim is pretty important for Sufi orders as well. And that is all about this master student relationship. The disciple or aspirant, the murid, is said to focus on the master as an object of aspiration, the murad. The chief disciples are chosen to act as the successors or the khalifa or representatives, muqaddam, of the master. All right. And here, in an illustration from the 1760, we have six Sufi masters coming together and talking together. And this is meant to be, it's sort of the who's who of Sufi masters, according to this artist. And as you can tell, it's very beautiful and sophisticated artwork, and it's often done with high quality watercolor and gold leaf in these kinds of images. All right. In early Sufism, sometimes the relationship between the master and the disciple will be described like this. Sadr al-Qunawi will describe, Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi will describe it as, I have drunk from the breasts of two mothers. And again, if you're finding that echo with Hildegard, it's because it exists, right? Um, and often Sufis will co-opt, especially because a lot of these orders are going to be run by men, which is not to say that women can't be a part of it. That's one of the issues with Sufism and gender, is that Sufism, because it challenges conventional gendered understandings, it gives space for women to live their lives outside of the constraints of the patriarchy that they may have been living under. So Sufi husbands, Sufi wives, for example, may not want to copulate with their husbands any further. And so in some, we have actually early manuals, and this in particular has been covered by scholars such as Laurie Silvers. She discusses how husbands would want to praise the piety of their wives to ensure that no one else thinks that they're impotent, right? So it's not that I can't do the sex, it's that she doesn't want to do it because of her love for God. And so that is what we should make praiseworthy for her. And so gender is a bit of a play in Sufism, and it's become also more intense in the present because that's the space where a lot of women who have joined Sufi orders or who have taken a hand from Sufi masters, their sense is that this is a non-patriarchal space of Islam, and so there is a very serious negotiation taking place as well on that issue. Often in the poetry about the relationship between master and disciple, we're going to deal with imagery such as breastfeeding, nurturing in the womb, or inserting or ejaculating semen into the disciple's womb, which will then mature. And even there, I heard an argument at the International Association of Quran Studies that the word Quran, Qurra, could conceivably come from the Yemeni Arabic meaning an ejaculation. So the idea from the mystic perspective is that this is God inseminating the world with this new knowledge. Which is what this kind of imagery would tie up to as well. And if you want to know more about these early relationships, I do recommend Margaret Malamud's article on gender and spiritual self-fashioning, the master-disciple relationship in classical Sufism. Um, Let me also give you an anecdotal story about a Sufi master from Bulle Shah. This is a sort of a traditional image of Bulle Shah available in his shrine is in Punjab in Pakistan. Um, and in the kind of Urdu script, it says here, Tere ishq nachaya. Nachaya is made me dance, but it's not like I was made to dance. It's that the command of dance was received by me. And this and the kind of apocryphal story around this poem is Bulle Shah upsets his master, and his master leaves the house, and Bulle Shah dresses up like a bride. He dresses in his sister's clothes like a woman. He paints his face, and then he positions himself on the path which his master will walk back on the way back from the city, and he starts to dance. And he writes this poem in response to that. So he says here, your love has made me dance to a fast beat. Your love has taken aid within my heart. This cup of poison I drank all by myself. Oh, come, my physician, or else I breathe my last. Your love has made me dance to a fast beat. The translation, one must always be careful about translations, like as has been said of beautiful translations and perhaps of beautiful men, that if it is if it is true, it is not beautiful, and if it is beautiful, it is not always true. So in this particular case, I think the translator is trying to give a little bit of flair in English, and it does not hold to the sense in the Punjabi poetry here, especially because certain sounds in Punjabi, like ta, which is at the end of the second line there, is hard to translate because it's kind of it's a feeling that you're meant to create by saying the sound, right? So, but that's the kind of relationship between master and student. It is almost a sexual relationship. It's almost a loving relationship. The idea that you would present yourself to your murshid or your master as a woman indicates two things. One is a subordination of the ego, that you are not embarrassed to dress up in drag and present yourself to your spiritual master. But the second thing is that it's also indicative of how gendered language works. So for Islam, women tend to be subordinate in the social order, even if they're not in the spiritual order. So their prayers are just as valuable, but socially they would be inferiors for the most part. And often in the master-disciple relationship in Sufism, it's construed as a relationship between the man and a woman. Think about the same kind of thing when you're going to encounter in the Hebrew Bible the ways that Israel is meant to interact with God. Daniel Boyarin talks about this. He says Israel is meant to be the bride presenting herself to God. And so when Israel takes a very masculinist and aggressive posture, it presents itself as the man to a male God, which creates a crisis. Um, and also Sufis, because in general of the gender play and the kind of flirtatious nature of the language, has always had a high appeal for queer folk, right? Whether or not there was such a thing as a queer identity historically in the past at this time, there was always a certain affinity of this poetry because it is dealing with same gendered love or same sex love, even if it doesn't mean same-sex sexual relationship, right? The poetry is filled with the erotics of that. Um, these are my last couple of slides. So here we are dealing with the issue of the saints and sainthood. So one of the central themes of Sufism is the Islamic doctrine of sainthood. Ernst covers this on page 48. The walaya or wilaya, which donates closeness and intimacy with God, as well as the protection by God. The saint, the plural, wali or awliya, is equivalent to the Persian great man or buzurg or old man. The Turkish man of God is eren. It was a figure who could intercede with God. And what that means is you may go to a saint shrine to pray for intercession on your behalf on Judgment Day. So when the end of days comes, that a saint or a friend of God, someone who is an intimate with God, knows God well, would advocate for you on Judgment Day. So often in Islamic sense, in the Islamic sense, judgment is depicted as a weighing of the scales of justice. And so what you're asking the saint to do is put their finger on the scale. This is quite popular in sort of Shia practice as well, is that you would ask perhaps for intercession of the imams or of the other beloveds of God, the Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the tent of Muhammad. Those kind of people were people that you may pray to for intercession. Again, in terms of general conservative Muslim practice, this is quite shocking. The idea that there would be any intercessors would be quite shocking. But for Sufi practice, and also just remember, this is local organic practice as well in a village, that these figures who seem holy, it might make sense to you that this is the person that I should go and ask to advocate for me. The saint's closeness to God and consequent authority are themes that go back to the earliest stages of Sufism with this prescriptive ideal and an implicit critique of worldly power. Eventually, the tombs of saints will become centers for widespread pilgrimage, as such as peoples of all classes sought ongoing living presence of the saint as a conduit to spiritual and material goals. So, for example, there are shrines in places like Pakistan, which, if you are impotent, you may go to the saint shrine. The saint shrine would have sort of a spiritual consultant who you would talk to. That spiritual consultant may write down some verses of the Quran on a slate tablet, wash that tablet into a vial, tell you to drink that, tell you to stay up all night fast and pray to God, and hopefully that will be the solution to your problem. Now, again, that may seem silly to us in our context today, but just keeping in mind historically, if you did not have any other course, any other appeal that you could make, you may want to turn to the local Sufi who may have a way to help you, even if that Sufi is just taking your problem seriously, as opposed to the Western trained doctor who may be in town. So, not to say that one should go rushing to the shrine instead of the hospital, but rather that these are integrated in a system of well being, which is important for these people on the ground, which is hard to understand in a world without saint shrines. So, in Halifax, we don't have the shrine to appear, although Philadelphia does. There's um, a saint who's died in Philadelphia, and his shrine has become a place of pilgrimage for a lot of local Philadelphia Muslims, especially from the subcontinent. And also, the saint's birthday is usually a ruckus celebration at their shrine. So their shrine may look something like this depicted here. This is the mausoleum of a 13th century Sufi saint Nizamuddin Auliya in Delhi, in Delhi, in India. This shrine on his birthday, his Milad, would be a ruckus celebration with drums and dancing and hash and bhang, which is a very intoxicating drink, and people sort of enjoying themselves to the maximum to celebrate the saint. And as you can imagine, these activities, these ritualized acts, have an importance for the maintenance and sustenance of the community beyond merely being an opportunity to go get high, right? Like, so this is also a chance for you to meet all of your community members together and celebrate. And there are well documented records of places like India where, before the modern classification of Hindu and Muslim, we have a sense that Hindus and Muslims together would have gone to these saint shrines. And if you want to see this in play, you can see it even in films, like in popular Indian films such as Amar Akbar Anthony, where the characters who are a Hindu son, a Muslim son, and a Christian son all go together to the shrine of the Shirdiwala Sai Baba, um, and they go to his shrine. He's a Sufi saint, and his eyes, the eyes of his statue, are meant to be able to give you darshan, the two-way gaze, and allow to heal your wounds or fix things. And so the plot of the movie is one of the women is blind, and she goes and prays at the shrine, and the saint lifts the veil of blindness from her eyes. So that kind of story is quite popular. So, with that said, this is the sort of the culmination of the lecture portion of today. And I thank you again for joining us for this portion. For the next class, we are going to be dealing more specifically with the historical origins of this thing that we have tried to define today as Sufism. So Sufism is all of the stuff that we have discussed today, but now let's see in the origins of where this movement lies. So where would we, if we were historians, to trace the first parts of this movement? And where we are going to start with that is in and around Baghdad. So that's where the story is going to start for us. And we're going to be working not with the text next week. So if you are following along as a member of the public, please feel free to read chapter 2, but we will not be getting to chapter 2 of Ernst's book until class 3. In class 2, I will be giving us more of a historical sketch of where all of this comes from. And with that said, if I'm not seeing any questions from the public, I will thank you for coming and I will stop the recording here. And I will just switch to some housekeeping for our students. Seeing none, I do hope that you enjoyed today's presentation. I'm sorry if it seemed a little bit dry because we have to cover an awful lot of information before we can get into the nitty gritty of Sufism. But my hope is in the other classes, as we are beginning to play a bit more with the poetics and not dealing with the epistemological structure, it'll start to be a little more fun. Let me stop. Not dry but fast. Yeah, I know. That's a curse of mine. All right, let me stop the recording here and thank the members of the public, and then let me switch to our students.